And we are live. Fortunately, you come for the HP content, not our broadcasting technical capabilities. We are literally 10 minutes late
And
today.
our timeliness. You don't come for our timeliness either.
No, no, you don't come for our timeliness. So, whilst I coordinate the rest of the content for this podcast, Glenn, maybe you could give us a little bit of a recap of the event that we were at a few weeks ago, API Strat, or if you prefer, Appy Strat. There's nothing like a name that has two pronunciations.
I'm still struggling with that. I just have a really hard time calling it Appy Strat, but I'm going to try for this call. Hello, everybody. Great to be back for episode 2. Yeah, so I attended Appy Strat. Actually, I was fortunate to be one of the keynote speakers. We had a couple of keynote speakers. My talk was on, and anybody who's been following me won't be surprised on this topic of serverless extensibility, which is really talking about an emerging pattern that we're seeing in the industry, all of us, where products are starting to leverage serverless platforms to deliver on certain value propositions, particularly around extensibility, making it easier for customers to go into a product and tailor it through code. So that's what my talk was about. I hadn't really heard much about the Microsoft Graph before, so it was really interesting. I saw a talk from Yina Arinas, if I pronounced that correctly, on the Microsoft Graph. And what I found really interesting about that, so for people that don't know, the Microsoft Graph is kind of a consolidated OData feed that pulls together resources of different teams all across Microsoft, different services, and provides a single entry point to get access to all of those services. So in the past, if you wanted to use one service and another service, often you had, depending on which team it lived in, completely different authentication methods. The APIs look completely different. Azure, of course, has done a lot of work to basically try to provide a standard set of guidelines. I think, Daryl, you might have had something to do with that.
Well, most of the guidelines, the Microsoft One API guidelines, were published before I actually joined. I've done a few PRs to it, and there's a few outstanding ones that need some love and attention.
I think I've trolled it once or twice.
That's right. Yes, you made some friends there, didn't you?
Well, you know me. But what I think it was trying to do was, come up with a uniform way that that Microsoft's going to design their APIs from a guidelines perspective. A lot of legacy out there that was only really being, heavily used for APIs that were living in Azure. And so with the Graph, what I thought was really interesting is they now were able to take, lots of different, I think it's something like 1,000 resources throughout the company, and provide this single way, uniform way to get access to all of the data in those different services. And it's not just the technology part of it that interests me. What interested me is also the story of how, APIs really have an opportunity to bring different groups together and break down silos, and also to provide a better experience for customers. And from what I can see with what I learned about the Microsoft Graph and the kind of adoption that's happening, it's actually delivering on that vision. It's getting groups that normally are silos to actually work with each other and to find ways to provide their data so that the data can be used together, which is opening up new types of use cases. So I thought it was really cool. And I really liked hearing, too, that it was a very bottoms-up kind of motion, a grassroots movement. And I got a chance, fortunately, to have some really good conversations with Yina, who, by the way, I think would be great to have on the show as one of our guests.
And we could do that one day, once we get our stuff organized that we can actually have a guest on.
And if we're on time, because she might just be like, these guys are late, I'm gone. And we might be like, and now our guest, and there's no guest there. That probably wouldn't be very good. But no, I thought it was a really interesting story. And, it's interesting. I made a comment about how, I think OData has evolved a lot. I used to not be the biggest fan But one thing I can say that I think has been really great, and probably becoming an open standard has really helped with this as well, is that I think the team has been extremely receptive, and I mean, it's no longer just the team. The evolution of the spec, they've really been listening, and from when I've seen it recently, it's at least a lot easier for me to digest it. But seeing how it was able to help solve this really, really big problem that has now really gotten a lot of traction at Microsoft, and tons of groups are now coming in and wanting to be in the graph. I think that's exciting, and that's a huge change, and it's a testament to the value that APIs bring. So there you go. That's my
Yes, it was quite an exciting API strat. All the usual suspects were there. It was a little different this time around because API strat in the past has been run primarily by 3Scale, who have been acquired now by Red Hat. So there was a transition of the organization of it over to the Open API initiative, which is now the body that manages the Open API, formerly known as Swagger specification. So there was a lot more people involved in bringing that together, and there was a few teething problems of transitioning the conference over. But all in all, it went very well. Definitely a conference.
Yeah, my other favorite part was getting to attend your workshop.
Oh,
I was a good student there. I didn't troll.
Yes, I did a workshop on OpenAPI v3 and tried to present some of the more fancy features, the support for callbacks and the support for, well, I didn't actually cover links, but so and just to compare and track and contrast, because not many people have started to really use OpenAPI v3 in anger. I think a lot of people are still waiting for all of the tooling to come to fruition. Although the Smartware folks have got their Swagger tools supporting version 3, and there's lots of activity going on, lots of interest in supporting the new features.
Yeah, I also thought it was great too, because I had never met Tony Tam before outside of Twitter. I thought the panel was really interesting that you guys did. It was just a really nice event too. There were some really interesting companies. Like every company that was there as a vendor too was really kind of promoting their API efforts. I found out about a really cool API that Capital One was working on, which I found was interesting because they were using the data that they have, which they collect from merchants and around all the transactions that people are performing, and they came up with a really interesting idea of a service that allows you to look at how popular a certain establishment is, primarily like restaurants initially, by correlating the data that they have of credit card transactions with geolocation and like where things are happening. They've provided a service that kind of augments Yelp, and I think something like Yelp would use it, where like let's say there's a restaurant that I want to go to. Sometimes those restaurant listings will post like favorite times and things like that, but they're not they're just based on a number, on a value that they put out there. Whereas what they were doing is they were taking the transactions and looking at the frequency of transactions, and from that they were basically correlating to say, here's when the most busiest times are, here's when the lighter times are. So if you're planning to come to this restaurant, you can basically say, oh well, this is a light time. So anyway, I thought it was a really interesting use case. And Capital One was trying to make this generally available as an API that other developers can use to build out other kinds of use cases. And I thought that was really interesting.
It's a very interesting story, the Capital One story. I mean, it's a bank, right? We don't really expect banks to be at the forefront of pushing technology, but the Capital One have hired a lot of very smart people from the API space, and that program is really pushing things forward. And in some ways, it's a little scary to think of what are the possibilities of what people could do with the data that banks have when it comes to exposing intelligent APIs for people to make either decisions on or to expose data in various different ways to different people, beyond the traditional, here I have a banking app on my phone that allows me to scan a check and deposit a check.
Yeah, the whole fintech movement is really interesting too. I don't know if you've heard of it, but in the last 2 years, I was involved with a small effort using the Open Bank API. Have you heard of the Open Bank API?
I haven't, no.
You should check it out. We can share the link later. So the Open Bank API is like an open source. You can almost think of it as like it's almost like the common service locator for banks. So when they're
not a good analogy.
Well, in this sense, it is. They basically have created a standard API that banks can implement this API. And what this enables is third-party developers, like if you think of something like Simple or some of there are other mobile banking solutions that are out there where they're not part of a big bank and they want to offer some value above and beyond simple just transactions and banking. So what they've done with Open Bank API, it's an open source standard and API effort. You can find them on GitHub. They have a server, which is like a Node server that implements the API. You can run that locally as a developer or deploy it into, AWS or Azure or whatever. Develop an application that meets the standard, and they give you like a simulated bank. And then what you can do is any bank, and there are like hundreds of banks in the world right now that are implementing this open API. And some of them are like really big. Europe, it really took off in Europe.
But is this related to the PSD2 initiative?
I have no idea what PSD2 is.
So PSD2 is
just open up your browser, go to Open Bank, search for Open Bank, and you'll find a whole website.
Okay, well, we'll take a look at that, and maybe we'll have a longer conversation on it, because I know in Europe they have this regulation coming in called PSD2, which is it's a regulation where every bank must provide an API to their services. So
Open Bank has been around a few years, and there have been a bunch of fintech startups that built around it, and there have also been a bunch of fintech hackathons sponsored by big banks like HSBC that are promoting. It's being very disruptive. Open Bank has really been something that's been, because the banking industry has traditionally been this big, as you mentioned, monolithic thing, and you never thought of like extensibility or ecosystem when it came to banks. You thought of really, really big companies that partner with banks. And so as part of their embracing of APIs, Open Bank has been part of that. Actually, when I was at API Strat, I talked to some of the Capital One about Open Bank, and I think they didn't know about it, but I told them you should check this out. It's pretty interesting. There's even an Open Bank Slack.
Yeah, and I see that the Open Bank project has PSD2 compliance. So I guess it's one way.
I wouldn't be surprised if they're one of the drivers behind, very essentially involved with that, because this has been. You can go look at the list of banks. There's literally like maybe thousands of banks that are supporting this now. That's a really interesting idea. Yeah, cool.
So I think we've done the Appy Strat to death there. What I wanted to do, because we have some questions that are kind of lots of opinions, and we could just kill the rest of our time here on that. So before we go into the questions from our Slack channel, I'd like to just mention one thing that I ran into a few weeks ago, which is an HTTP extension. I found it on the GitHub repo for the HTTP working group, and it is a proposal by Poul Henning Kamp, who's the guy behind the Varnish caching layer, and it's a proposal to moving forward to try and standardize how we create new headers or the values for new headers. So at the moment, you say, okay, well, I need this new header, and you give it a header name, and then you have a value property which has a certain syntax, and that syntax is described using the ABNF format. But ABNF can be anything, right? You can describe any kind of text-based syntax using ABNF. So this proposal is to try and create a more structured format with basically an identifier value and key value pairs, so that just to really improve parsing and validation, because at the moment you can't really validate an HTTP header value unless you know the specific header already, and if it's a custom header, then you can't do anything with it. So this would basically give some way of validating and improving performance too, because if you have a standard structure, you don't have to have a arbitrary ABNF parser to be able to parse almost any kind of header that comes through. So I thought that was quite interesting, and it allows you to distinguish between existing headers that have their own custom format and these new formats by using angle brackets around the header value, but the other way around. So like it starts with a greater than and ends with a less than value. So you know that if it's a header value inside those characters, then it's using this new one. I mean, it's really still a very early draft of the standard, but I thought that was kind of a cool idea for moving forward.
Very interesting.
Yes, yes. So I'll if I think of some other interesting headers. But anyway, the GitHub repo, I put a link to it in our Twitter account for In the Mood for HTTP, which is trickily shortened to In the Mood for, using the number 4 instead of FOR, because I ran into character length in the name of Twitter accounts. So that Twitter account has links to the repository of HTTP working group stuff that's going on there. And there's some cool stuff happening in that. That's worth keeping an eye on. So unless you have other technical content, because we want to try and provide some meat before just killing people with our opinions.
I've got a 1 minute. Of course, we have AWS reInvent going on, and there's some interesting things that are happening there. One, I guess I'll mention is there was a new offering that AWS reInvent announced called AppSync, AWS AppSync, which is a GraphQL. I mean,
Glenn, you know the rules.
A standard graphing query language offering.
We used up like at least a year's worth of time last week talking about that thing that shall not be named.
But they have a new offering to help you build Voldemort solutions. So yeah, so I thought that was interesting. Anything that you saw at reInvent that you thought was
well, they have their new graph database, Neptune. And I was quite impressed that they're using Gremlin and Apache Tinkerpop as the querying language, because I think Gremlin is a delightful language for querying graph databases. So I was quite pleased to see that one. And then from more
would you choose Gremlin over OData?
Oh, absolutely. Yes,
I didn't just get you fired, did I?
My Microsoft loyalties only go so far, right?
That's why we love you, Daryl.
You know, even for OData, there are a lot of the stuff on the graph that is kind of, it looks OData-ish and it follows OData conventions. Yeah. Behind the scenes, it's not using the standard OData engine, because one of the challenges with OData is it defines a lot of capabilities, and not everybody needs all of those capabilities. So what ended up happening is people kind of picked and choose the things. Like even in the management API for the service that I work on in API management, we use a lot of the conventions with regards to the query parameters for filtering and for skip and top and stuff like that. But we don't use, we don't do the direct OData library to EF entity framework querying on the back end. So there are a very large range of how people apply the ideas of OData. So
I guess another interesting one that we heard was well, actually, did you have another one you wanted to? Did you have any?
I do, but go ahead first.
No, you go first.
Oh, I'll go first. Okay, so the Amazon API Gateway, which is sort of, again, a competitor to the product I work on, API management. Although API Gateway sits primarily in front of Lambdas, we sit in front of any back API. So they introduced this new idea of canary release deployments, where there's this idea of, okay, we have this new piece of functionality, which is new and improved, and I want to put it into production, but let's not, do a giant switchover. Let's just kind of do a partial canary release. And I believe one of the ways that you can allow traffic to go to this canary release on AWS Gateway is like a percentage diff. So you can say 20% of the traffic goes to the canary and 80% goes. Basically, you can gain confidence over time that you didn't screw the pooch and only affect a few customers. So that's a feature there. The interesting part about that ties back to one of the talks I did at API Strat, where I talked about this notion of versions and revisions. And in some work that we've been doing on API management, we've kind of drawn this distinction between versions and revisions, where a version is a new version of an API that you allow a consumer to opt into. And you usually do that by changing some identifier in the query, in the URL. And whereas a revision is a change where you're going to release a new version, and when you're ready, you're just going to push it down to the consumer automatically. So you better not have any breaking changes. So this canary release is one way of doing sort of a revisions type mechanism. So that's actually been quite a bit of my time for the last 6 months, 8 months working on this versions and revisions feature. And hopefully, if I didn't spend time doing things like that, we could actually hit the GA date of January.
Okay, I'm going to be disciplined. I'm going to actually restrain myself, which is difficult. Yes. And let's move on from events to talking about some meat.
Yeah, I'm surprised you haven't used the phrase time box, Glenn. Like, whenever I work with you on something, you would always say, okay, we need to time box this, right? So that we don't go over. That was...
You know who I blame for that? I blame Peter Provost. Years ago, from when we worked together in Patterns and Practices team, drilled that into my head. I'm usually awful at it, but I make myself feel better at least that I'm,
But stating that you want to time box something.
Exactly. Intention is, half of the problem. So
that's right. Okay, so we're going to go to our Slack channel and look at some of the questions that were asked. Well, there were a whole slew of questions asked primarily by Kevin Swiber, and I do feel like we were both being a little trolled by this question. But there is some real valid sentiment behind it. And
I got an interesting idea, by the way. I just want to mention that spurred to my brain, which is like there are a lot of ongoing interesting conversations in the Mood for HTTP. So in the HTTP API Slack channel. Yes. One of the things we could look at doing, aside from just the things that people submit, is actually scan those threads periodically, and if they're ones that come up that are interesting, there was a particularly incendiary one recently, for example, around hypermedia. But anyway, I just thought that might be an interesting thing for us to do, being that these conversations are happening, is to just scan. Anyway,
and then
that was rude. I cut you off. I apologize.
That quote of the century. What was it? Where did somebody say? I thought SAP invented REST.
Yeah,
that was wow.
Breathe.
So Kevin asked, why is building a REST API seemingly harder than every other network interaction technology that's ever been built?
That's a very interesting. I have an answer to that.
Okay. Hit me with it.
A lot of the technologies that have been delivered have been very kind of RPC and really more transport based, just getting bytes across the wire. And HTTP in its design is really a very flexible application protocol that allows a lot of richness in terms of what it can express and what it can do. And it's not simply about transferring bytes. And that was actually an opening for me when I was on the I hate to admit it, but when I was on the WCF team early on, and when I was first learning about, why isn't what we have in WCF sufficient for doing the kinds of things that we want to do? And it became a realization to me that we are treating HTTP as just a way to transport bytes across the wire. That's really not what it was designed
but there's
for.
so much more. I mean, even taking WCF as an example, there's a whole notion of contracts and behaviors that you can layer into there. And the tools that Kevin mentions is like GraphQL, because I'm allowed to say that, right? And gRPC. These tools are perceived to be easier to get started with, and I think maybe one of the reasons is because they are much more prescriptive, and they're saying you should do it this way, and oh, by the way, here's a bunch of tools of how you should do it in this prescriptive fashion. The problem with REST is it's not prescriptive.
Well, they're putting a protocol on top that is more constrained for doing a specific set of use cases. I think that's why they're becoming, like when you say I'm building a REST API, that could mean 100 zillion different things. Whereas when you say I'm building a GraphQL API, it is a defined domain to solve a very specific problem. When you use something like AMQP, it is pretty much like a defined protocol for solving a specific problem. And I think once you have a very defined protocol, it's easy to then build libraries that encapsulate that protocol, which is exactly what is happening with GraphQL, a huge ecosystem around a very well-defined space.
So then the question is it just that is it sad commentary on the tech space that we don't have people that are talented enough to take the constraints and do their own thing?
Well, we have.
Or is it just that it's nebulous and incomplete, and it's much better that people can take actually real concrete solutions that have solved X certain. I think the problem is just the fact that like GraphQL solves a certain domain of problems.
Yes.
gRPC solves a certain domain of problems. And if you're using it within that domain of problems, it's awesome. The problem is everybody tries to go outside of their domain. And I think it's when you apply those point solutions outside of your domain that you start to run into challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing is GraphQL is true to what it's trying to do, right? And not to keep talking about it. I mean, you say the same thing with OData. I mean, there was a very specific focus of what it was being built for. Yeah, I think you're onto something. I mean, I think when you look at something like GraphQL, it fell out of trying to solve a very specific problem. Sometimes we've seen with some of the API standard efforts an approach to say, here's a generic problem that the industry is facing, and I'm going to build something to address it, as opposed to, here's a problem that we're facing that we need to solve. And as part of solving that, we realize that we've opened up something that can help other people as well.
So the real question is then, take hypermedia. Is the reason why there's not been any major adoption outside of the web browser of hypermedia because the fact that nobody's built that prescriptive tooling? Or is it just that it's really difficult to build that prescriptive tooling?
I'm going to start with the problem with hypermedia is the name hypermedia. I mean, I almost like the same thing with HaitiOS. I mean, now having been around the space for like almost 10 years, there's a esoteric nature to it. A lot of people just don't get it. I mean, I think that came out, honestly, to be honest, in that thread in Slack is, there's a lot, I see what, I mean, although that was a bit incendiary, I think there's a lot of people that are just like, they don't see the value. And part of the problem, I think, with it is that a lot of the discussions about hypermedia have been grounded for a long time in, you should do this because this is how the web was built. And that just doesn't convince people. Like, show me some real problems that you're solving. And I'm a big fan, obviously. I mean, I think hypermedia has a lot of power. But as long as the discussion, like when you look at what people are doing with GraphQL, it's like they will show you like an app, and here's the kind of things that this is enabling, and here's how painful it was before. And we've tried to do that with hypermedia, but I just think we've not nailed it. It still has ended up resting in this world of ambiguity, where to some it's like crystal clear, but to many it's overwhelming. It's like, why do I need to worry about this?
Right.
My jQuery library doesn't show me this. So I do think if it was in the libraries, so like, it would become something that would be there and people would benefit from it, and that would maybe help. But yeah, I don't think we've found, like even with OData, one of the things I was excited about OData is the fact that it was using linking to really solve a problem, whether they're static design time links or whatever, doesn't matter.
Right.
The point was they were using links in the payload. And I mean, RSS was a great example, but it's like you look at RSS and it's like the average person just doesn't think about that. They don't sit there dreaming about RSS and say, RSS.
It just works, right?
RSS did it, so that means my life is better.
Yeah.
So
okay,
anyway,
so I had this thought yesterday as to maybe a way of reframing how we promote the benefits of this slightly different way of building APIs, as we who think we understand REST think that APIs should be built.
I honestly do think the term, by the way, does have I'm not just kidding when I say that the term itself sounds very like mystical.
There's a lot of baggage to it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that I've seen, one of the things that has been done in the Azure Management API clients. So they use OpenAPI to describe the APIs, and they project it down with a tool called AutoRest to generate a bunch of client libraries, much like Swagger Code Gen did. It's kind of the holy grail. We want to just auto-generate all these client SDKs. And the problem is, in order to project those things down mechanically, you need a fairly simplistic API that basically just has a domain model on the server side, and then you project it into a domain model on the client side, which ends up with what I feel is a fairly chatty API. And one of the things that GraphQL was designed to try and solve, this chattiness that comes when people, people accuse REST of causing it, but it's really just an oversimplification of how REST is supposed to work that actually causes it. So, but what they've done, what the client development team have done, is they've built a Fluent API over the top of the existing client libraries. And it got me thinking, is like, why is it that people look at Fluent and go, hey, this is really cool to have a Fluent API to be able to describe things, but that hypermedia stuff is all bullshit, architecture, astronauty stuff. Because really what a Fluent API does for you, right, is it allows you to make an interaction and then get presented with a set of choices based on the previous context of that interaction.
Yes, it's contextual.
It's doing exactly the same. The only problem with layering a Fluent API over a client library that is chatty in the back end is you now have a nice, cool interface that is task-oriented on the front end, but then the network traffic is not.
So
let me just finish the thought. What if we build the usual kind of cruddy REST API that everybody expects, and I don't mean cruddy and crappy, I mean cruddy as in create, read, update, delete, because that's sort of what everybody expects HTTP APIs to look like today. But then also, secondarily, create some additional resources in the API that allow a more fluent experience of working with the API, and deploy them together as a single package so you can pick and choose. If you want to do that thing that has never been thought of before, you can go directly against the CRUD API. But if you're using common paths, then choose the optimized use case scenario-based resources that are designed so that you can do that thing in one round trip rather than doing it in 3 round trips.
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at too is, there's this movement around this idea of purpose-built APIs. Instead of having, I mean, in a lot of ways, you can think of an API as a user experience, right? There's a user experience there. It is your UI, so to speak, of your services. If you're a client who is consuming that API, you think of it almost like a UI. It has an experience, etc. The other theme is around the idea that those APIs should not be designed in a server-centric way. Those APIs should be designed to service the needs of the client. If you really want to have APIs that are broadly going to be adopted and used, that don't make the decisions of what is in the API surface based on what's going to make the server happy, do it to make the client's job easier, because that's really where the challenges are going to be. And often that's also where the value is going to be. The value of the API is not that the API exists. The value of the API is that it offers that value to the clients that are consuming it. So having different types of APIs to solve different problems, I think makes a lot of sense. And GraphQL, just to raise that again, is hitting on some of that, in the sense of like, what it's doing though is saying, instead of you purposely building these very specific APIs, and of course it's addressing the round tripping problem. So it's still not necessarily addressing a purpose-built user experience to solve the problem I'm trying to solve. It's just giving me a way to do the things I want to do with less hops and get back that related data. The one challenge I think you'll face there, Daryl, is just the amount of work.
Yeah,
building out the CRUD API and building out the purpose-built layer. But I really like it because.
But you can do it in a point system, right? Like here's one particular scenario that we can optimize by adding this other resource. The challenge that I've run into is there is a certain perspective that says thou shalt only expose your entity once in the API, because if it exists twice in the API, then that's going to confuse people.
Yeah. No, I know that's
right. So that's the roadblock that I think you first have to get over. The fact that an API doesn't have to only show a particular entity once. Like if you compare it to the database, right? It's not exposing your tables; it's exposing your views, and views is a denormalized view of your data model.
So going back, I just want to go back in time a bit here related to this conversation. Early on, when I was first learning about, HTTP back in like 2009, I think 2009, 2010, when we first started to cross paths more in the REST Discuss group, the famed group. One of the things that really impressed me in those days around hypermedia was the work that Restfully was doing.
Right, the Ruby guys.
Because what I thought was really interesting, and I tried to replicate this, like when I was in WCF at one point, you don't know this, but we were actually working on a tooling to generate like a hypermedia client. And it was going to embrace dynamic. But what I found was interesting, like why I'm bringing this up, is that what Restfully did is they had a client, and actually Traverson has this to a bit today, which is a JavaScript client, which I demoed actually when I spoke at API Days New Zealand. Unfortunately, the video didn't capture the demo, which sucks. It captured me talking about the demo. So don't do that, events. Make sure you capture the screen.
And here we have over here.
It's horrible. I was so happy the talk came out well, but I didn't get that stuff. But anyway, but the idea that they had was that, like every resource is going to return some links, and it embraced dynamic in the sense that there didn't have to be strongly typed code gen or anything like that, but it had a convention where, let's say there was a link called payment. Well, I could literally like get that resource and do like .payment or .actions.payment. And then if I gave it parameters, it would know to turn that into a post against that resource. And it would give me that fluent experience. And I think you were doing some stuff with this back in the day too, right? With some of your HTTP client.
I built a library called REST Agent, which attempted to abstract away HTTP and just provide this kind of set of links that you could follow. And then I learned about the evils of abstracting away HTTP.
Yeah, I'm still on the fence with it, right? At the end of the day, it's like, is it so important that the people that are, that folks understand exactly what hypermedia is? Or is it more important that we just get adoption of hypermedia if it really solves a problem, which you need to be able to justify, um, and then it just becomes prevalent? Because
Yeah.
that's what I think is really happening with GraphQL, by the way. There's a whole ecosystem of library. So I think it goes back to your tooling thing. There's a whole ecosystem of library and tooling that people are finding useful. They find the problems that GraphQL is solving useful. Then they learn about GraphQL in the process. But what sold them was, hey, this is going to make my life easier. Hey, I don't have to build a server. There's a library that will do it for me. I don't have to build a client. There's a library that will do it for me. So yeah, I think much as we go against the current of tooling, tooling really is the way.
Okay.
Tooling and libraries.
I think I can transition nicely into our last topic here.
Sure.
Is that I think one of the great things about GraphQL is the fact that you are expressing your intent completely within a payload that goes over the wire that is completely tech agnostic. It doesn't matter whether you're talking to a JavaScript server, a JavaScript
Yep.
Node.js, whether you're talking to C#. Doesn't matter. It is a completely defined payload.
It doesn't matter who
that expresses your intent.
It doesn't matter who the client is or who the server is. It really is
exactly.
agnostic.
So that brings us to Joseph Gardner's question, which is, why is there no love for contract-driven development? And he gives an example of a project called Pact.io. That's PACT.io.
Okay.
And it is a platform that has been, or a framework that's been built on multiple different platforms with this idea of being able to define your payload as a contract. And then there's tooling on both sides to make sure it can interpret the tooling. I see this kind of perspective a lot. When a conversation on Twitter yesterday, somebody pointed me to a paper that was just written recently, which is called Modular Remote Communication Protocol Interpreters, and this is a Scala-based paper. And one of the headings is type-safe remote calls, which just sends shivers down my spine, because you just can't. So how do you balance these two basically contradictory goals in saying, I want to be able to guarantee that my client and server understand the same semantics, but I also want this to be really easy, right? And whenever you're talking across platforms, it's very challenging in order to get that interoperability between platforms. And I think locking it down and trying to do things type safe like we're used to in programming languages just isn't going to work in a remote way.
So I think this is another interesting place of where hypermedia even has a challenge. I'm just going to relate it because I think it is the mental model and paradigm of how people think about the web, right? So you read the HTTP spec and what were the goals and what it was designed for, and it was not about just transferring bytes across the wire, and it was not about objects, right? That actually, when I was trolling the API guidelines, that was one of the things I pushed on, right? Is like, no, REST is not about objects. REST is about, HTTP
representations,
resources and representations. Exactly. But many people don't know about that and don't really care about that. And as much as we've tried to go against the current of the wider community and say, no, this is what HTTP is about, it really hasn't. It's worked to some degree, but there are still people that think about this again as a transport protocol, right? I've got my objects here, I've got my objects there. I just want to basically like bridge those two. If you can do it, if the thing in the center is designed in the most Roy Fielding check stamped way, great. I don't care. Right. What I care about is my experience as either a server developer or a client developer.
Right. Now, I think the thing I like the most about this conversation about contract-driven development is we focus on payloads. One of the biggest mistakes that I see people making is coupling together resource design
Sure.
with payload design. As much as possible, if you make those independent, so you can send different payloads to different endpoints, and the endpoint has a significance, and the payload have a significance, and when you combine them together, then you get to do stuff. But when you end up basing your system that says, oh well, I know that when I hit this particular endpoint, I get this back. You tie yourself down tremendously. So although there's dangers to this discussion about contract delivery, I think contracts and messages are a key part of the solution moving forward. And if we can focus more on the actual messages, and when you get into that terrible conversation about versioning, is we should also think about versioning of messages independent to versioning of resources. Because I think
but if you go ahead,
if you do versioning of messages, it dramatically reduces the amount of time you have to spend versioning your resources, and is much more flexible because there's no problem with a single resource URL being able to accept messages with different versions. That's a much easier thing to do than to have different resources with different version numbers on them.
I think I agree with you, and I think part of the problem also honestly has to do with lack of experience of, like HTTP was really designed for building APIs that last a long time.
Yeah.
And when you really see the benefit is when you have APIs that have lasted for like 15, 20 years and they still work.
Yep.
And they've been able to evolve, right? And we talked about this also in our book. But a lot of people are not there, right? So they've just started out just building an API. They just want to deliver something to market. They may say, agile, I want to get it to market. I want to deliver value. And you're giving me all this sky is falling stuff.
Right.
But as far as the contractual side, and, I think if we can succeed in that of, basically getting people to think about the web from that perspective, or maybe they don't have to think about it that way, but that's just the way the tooling and things that they have works.
Yeah. Which is why I like the idea of layering affluent resources on top of your regular CRUD API, because you don't have to think about that up front. What you do is
you should prototype it.
You build the CRUD API, and then over time, where you notice that there are performance problems where people are having to make multiple requests, you layer a fluent resource that allows you to do it in less requests. And
so where's your GitHub repo that shows this?
I only thought of it yesterday. Come on.
You could start with just Markdown and literally like write the curl requests that people will issue for these different use cases and show the payloads, right? You could start from a design-oriented, which is a whole different question of how do you design APIs, which is probably another. We should have a show dedicated on that, and that's certainly something you've put a lot of thought around.
I might, I have this series of HTTP patterns that I'd been writing for a while. I might add a pattern, which is an example of, if you have two resources that you have to interact with in order to achieve this goal, here's a way of adding a third resource that allows you to do that same goal in one call.
I've got a better idea. We need to have pattern of the episode.
Pattern of
you are now going to every episode.
Okay.
Until you run out of patterns,
right?
You're going to have or pattern of the week or whatever, and it is going to be you sharing one of your HTTP patterns. How many do you have in your library?
I have about 10 at the moment.
Perfect.
And 3 more that I need to write up.
That will cover a year of episodes, and that will give you plenty of time to think about more to put in the queue.
Wait, we're doing bi-weekly. That's 26 episodes a year.
Oh, that's true. It'll cover 6 months.
Well, we have run out of time. We have shared lots of opinions. Hopefully, we've shared some useful information as well as just our opinions.
At least we got to some questions this time, which was good.
Well, we tried the questions last week.
Yeah,
but we just went a little off.
I know. You can blame me for my GraphQL.
That's fine. That's fine. It's an important part of the ecosystem we all have to understand so that we can apply it appropriately and properly.
I think that's important, looking at it from the meta level. But anyway, good stuff. This was great. Oh, we should call out that we now have a logo.
We have a logo.
And this logo has a spiritual significance. It means we are actually committing to the show going forward. And we have a Medium blog where we will be posting all of the episodes, and that you will get a link to very shortly, where we'll put our first episode, and then this episode will come shortly thereafter. So we
have a YouTube channel, which hopefully we'll figure out how to get iTunes to view as a podcast, so that you don't actually have to show up at the same time as us, and you can just listen to it on your phone whilst doing your exercise, so you can doubly get benefit out of this time.
And we'll be getting some jazz music.
Oh, right.
At the beginning and the end, which
absolutely
I was on the hook to make that happen.
Got to try and pretend to be professional at this tech stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
See you again in 2 weeks.
Take care, everyone.